This is the sermon for the 18th Sunday after Pentecost. Today I'll be reading from the Gospel according to St. Luke, the 16th chapter, verses 1 through 13, and our text is as follows. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a steward, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your stewardship, because you cannot be my steward any longer.' Then the steward said to himself, 'What will I do, now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as steward, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'How much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest steward because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." This is the gospel of the Lord. Over the last few weeks, we have been working our way through some of the parables of Jesus. Now, you may have, like me, heard at some point in your life that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, I suppose that's as good a definition as any, but then again, I also think that it might give us the wrong impression, or what I believe is too soft an impression. We may have the sense that the parables are merely cute, catchy stories that are designed to reinforce more or less logical cultural viewpoints. But in truth, I think the parables serve two purposes, neither of which, by the way, is to reinforce our contemporary cultural perceptions. The first purpose, as I have said before, the parables are not so much something that we read, but rather that read us. Very often, our interpretation of the parable, what we believe its point to be, says way more about who we are and how we see the world than anything else. Secondly, the parables are, I am convinced, designed to jolt the hearer into a new way of thinking, to listening with new ears and comprehending a new kind of language. Parables are designed to shock people out of their old spiritual language, preparing them for God's kingdom as it breaks into our world. Now, that last point is nowhere more evident, I believe, than in this parable, that which we sometimes call the parable of the unjust or dishonest steward. This is perhaps the most problematic of all of Jesus' parables. For what exactly is being said here? That it's good to be dishonest? It's good to cheat one's employers? And just in the off chance the oddness of this story is not clear, let me put the story into somewhat more contemporary terms. Imagine, if you will, a man who works in a department store. We'll call him Mr. Smith. Now, say that Mr. Smith is the manager of the fine jewelry department in this store. One of his chief responsibilities is managing the credit and layaway accounts, as well as overseeing the other jewelry salespeople. Now, times being what they are, there have been rumors going around. Rumors of downsizing and layoffs. And what's more, he's heard his own name bandied about when others thought he wasn't listening. Well, one fateful Friday morning, he hears his name mentioned over the PA system. "Mr. Smith, please come to the personnel department." His heart skips a beat, for he is almost certain what he is being summoned for. And to be sure, not 20 minutes later, he is walking out of the personnel manager's office, pink slip in hand, with instructions to pick up his final paycheck and leave behind the keys to all the display cases before departing for the last time. Well, it's only 10 a.m., and Mr. Smith still has a whole day to work, a whole day in which to despair over what has just transpired. Sure, he realizes maybe he wasn't the best worker he could have been, he had his moments of laziness, maybe he wasn't the best manager around. But what will he do now? In this economy, jobs are hard to come by, and he's got a mortgage, and car payments, and the cable bill, and the cell phone, and the country club membership. So in his desperation, he hatches a plan. He begins going through the accounts and making telephone calls. "Mrs. Jones, do you remember that bracelet you put on layaway?" "Of course you do." "How much is left to pay on it?" "Well, yes, it's $500. But what would you say we made that $50? Yes, Mr. White, what's your monthly payment for the watch you're buying for your son's graduation?" $70 a month, you say? Well, how would you like to pay $10 a month instead? No, really? Yes, I knew you'd like that. And so the day progressed. Mr. Smith, imagining that by Monday, when he's out of work, maybe, just maybe, one of these people will remember him kindly. Perhaps give him a recommendation, or loan him a few dollars. Now, you might imagine that when the boss catches up with Mr. Smith, not only will he be out of a job, he may also be in big trouble. After all, he might be held liable for all those forgiven debts. Now, it doesn't have to be a department store jewelry manager. It could have been a bank financial officer who decided to lessen the total amount of principal due on a home loan, or a collections agent who halved the amount due on a delinquent credit card. In any case, those are not the employee's debts to forgive, and the one who does such a thing might very well be considered a thief. But now, when the store manager finally does get wind of what Mr. Smith has done, he commends him. By the way, it might be interesting to note that the Greek word we typically render shrewd is phronimos, that is, with a long second O. Well, if I say it that way, it does in fact mean shrewd. But if I say it phronimos with a short second O, it would mean wise. There might be a different moral implication between being shrewd and wise, but either way, the compliment is unexpected And it brings us back to the conundrum we encountered at the onset of our discussion. Just what is Jesus' point? To commend dishonesty? To suggest that when one is in a real jam of one's own making, it's okay to break the rules in order to curry favor? Isn't there quite enough of that going around? Aren't there enough lawbreakers, dishonest politicians, greedy corporate heads, and just plain crooks out there bending and breaking the rules, all for their own benefit? We surely don't need Jesus telling us to do this as well. The whole thing might become even more disturbing when I tell you that his master, the steward's master, in Greek is ho Kyrios, the Lord. So it becomes even more afflictive that it very well might be Jesus or even God the Father who is commending this unethical manager. The clue to understanding this parable comes first in its placement in the Lucan narrative, and then I think in the way in which Jesus closes this part of the narrative. The dishonest steward is placed immediately following a trio of parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and of course the lost sons. The parable sometimes known as the prodigal son, although I believe should really be called the prodigal father. Stories where we begin to understand that God's economic reasoning is as far from most logical human economics as the East is from the West. What shepherd would actually leave his whole flock in the open country to go after one that was lost? Or what housewife would really spend a whole lot of coins throwing a party to celebrate the finding of just one coin? And really, is the kind of parenting that prodigal father shows his wasteful son really such a good example? It is perhaps the last of the trio of lost parables that most sheds light on our current enigma. For the story of the prodigal son is a story of the power of forgiveness. And of course, we understand how the father can forgive his wayward son, for we can perhaps understand the unconditional love of a parent for a child. And we even understand the desire of a parent that all his children live in concord, that they forgive each other for past wrongs. Perhaps in that parable, we can see that forgiveness is the truest representation of love. And so I believe this story of the shrewd manager is no less a story of the power of forgiveness. What is it, after all, that the manager is in the end commended for? For forgiving. Wise or shrewd, phronimos or phronimos, it makes no difference. The steward comes to a place where he forgives the debts of others. Now, you may object on the grounds that the debts were not his to forgive. And you may object on the grounds that the steward wasn't being kind or loving. He was simply trying desperately to find a way out of his problem. And I would say that you are correct in both instances. And that is exactly the point. Maybe, just maybe, forgiveness is, as I said earlier, the truest representation of love. When Jesus pronounced forgiveness to the woman caught in the act of adultery, he gave her life back to her. When Jesus forgave Peter for denying him, his life and purpose were renewed. And when Jesus pronounced forgiveness from the cross on those who did not know what they were doing, and just as much on those who did, a process of the renewal of all creation began. No, the dishonest manager had no right to forgive those debts. But then, how many debts do we hold over people's heads that have nothing to do with us? And maybe, just maybe, as the truest representation of agape, forgiveness trumps reason. Forgiveness trumps morality. Yes, it's possible that forgiveness, a pure application of grace, is more important even than right and wrong. The glorious blasphemy that Jesus dies for, that God's forgiveness is bigger and better even than the law. So intrinsic is forgiveness in what the Father would have us become that one could say it almost doesn't matter why one forgives. If you can't forgive like the prodigal father of the wastrel prodigal son out of unconditional love, then do it because you have first been forgiven. Or do it because you think you'll curry favor with God or man, or do it because you'll stay out of hell, or increase your karmic chances of winning the lottery. Just forgive, because that is the way of love, and it is the way of eternal life. In verse 8, Jesus says, "For the people of this world are more shrewd," or perhaps that's wise, "in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light." Indeed, brothers and sisters, the people of the world know how to forgive, know how to look past the shortcomings of others when it suits them for the purposes of gain. My question to all of us is, can we, who bear the name of Christ, who are called to be bearers of his light, can we learn to forgive lavishly and illogically for any old reason, but mostly because of his great love to us?